Before I dive in, I was asked to make an announcement that there will be a sign-up genius that's sent to you regarding our hospitality and just some of the help that's needed, which is there's a lot of opportunity to get involved because there's a lot of background work that happens with it. And I don't know about you, but when I come in here and I see how nicely things are set up and the awesome options of food that we have, I'm like, this is just amazing. So Heather, thank you so much, and hope that you all I know she definitely deserves a clap for sure. Yeah. So today, where we're going in 1 Peter is the topic of suffering. And many of us think, when we think about suffering, we think about persecution, that it's happening out there as in across the ocean, right, in all these other worlds. But I recently came across information that it's actually even happening in our neighbor town of West Lynn. There is a video for that. Let's see if I can get there. I always struggle with this. Goodness gracious. Turn it, is that an issue? I think it is on. Okay. No, is that going backwards? Oh, dang. Can you help me with that, Teresa? Because I can't get it. I'm supposed to be able to click on it. I'm supposed to, Okay. Oh.
I don't know that I'm a self-proclaimed gangster.
Can
I'm
you
from
turn
the
it?
mean streets of West Lynn, Oregon. And I've seen things and been through things that somebody like you in your little pearly loft couldn't even relate to. And if you're asking me to share stories with you that are frankly none of your business, maybe I'll give you a couple and maybe you'll take a little smug look off your face. But I can date back to when I was 11 years old. I'm minding my own business and I'm in a park. This guy, stranger to me, takes a piece of gum out of his pocket, he puts it in his mouth, and he just throws the wrapper on the ground. He publicly litters. He just publicly litters. And I saw that. I had to see these things at a young age. Sure, somebody came along, somebody picked it up, somebody threw it in the trash can. But for the few moments where that sat on the ground and the law was violated right here in my neighborhood, what about the time I'm on the sidewalk and I watch a guy cross the street and he's not even within the lines? He's publicly jaywalking. There was a police officer standing right there. He didn't do anything. He didn't do anything. We have chaos. We had anarchy at times in West Lynn. You look at me. There was years where my father didn't even make $100,000, or barely made $100,000. And sure, we had a maid, but she only came twice a week. What do you think happened the other 5 days? You think those dishes washed themselves? You think those clothes got themselves in the hamper? My neighbors were twins. They got a Mercedes for their birthday, but just one. They had to share that car. They had to share that car. Who gets to drive today? I had to see these things. You ask me about being a gangster. You think I'm scared to go to Brazil? You haven't seen the things I've seen. You haven't been down that way. You haven't been to the mean streets of West Lynn, Oregon.
Oh my goodness. The reason why I start with that is for two reasons. One being that we're talking about suffering, and that's probably as funny as it's going to get, okay, during this time. So thought we might want to start with some laughter. But secondly, to be honest, I am not in a period of suffering in my life right now. While there are hard things, I wouldn't call them suffering necessarily. And so, when I think about suffering for me, it's like dang, where's that parking spot? I'm going to be late, or why do I have to color my hair every 4 weeks because it goes gray so fast, stuff like that. That's kind of a little bit more where I am in the realm, but here's who I would love to hear from, is people like Corrie ten Boom. She's a woman that lived through World War II in a camp, in a concentration camp, and saw her sister die. I'd love for her to be on this stage. I would love for Johnny Erickson Tata, who at an early age dove into some water and was paralyzed. I think neck down. I mean, yeah, she can't even use her arms. And hear her stories. There's a book I'm reading right now called Tortured for Christ, and it's about a man named Richard Wurmbrand, who lived in a communist prison in Albania when it was under communism, and he was imprisoned for 14 years, being tortured for his faith. Those are the people that I would like to have on the stage, because they've gone deep and they've stayed walking with the Lord, and I have so much to learn from them. Paul, it would be awesome to have Paul. In 1 Corinthians chapter 11, Paul lists a whole bunch of things that he went through. And a couple of them are that 5 times he went through 40 lashes minus 1. How do you do that? 3 times he was beaten with rods. 3 times he was shipwrecked. He was pelted with stones. He spent a night and a day in the open sea. I mean, the guy went through so much. I cannot relate. Today in North Korea, Iraq, Afghanistan, Iran, Christians are being jailed and tortured and are losing their lives. I don't know if any of you subscribe to Voice of America, but it is a wonderful website and even newsletter that keeps you current on what's going on in this world and the persecution and the hardness that people are going through. But the reality is, it's out there, but it's in our midst as well, right? We've got people that are going through health issues, and that some of them are chronic, some of them are terminal, some of them just don't go away. And you're like, Lord, how am I going to get through this? People are dealing with financial issues. People are dealing with in their marriages. They're in marriages that they're committed to, and yet they're lifeless and loveless. And it's a struggle, and it's a definite suffering place. Some of you are going through spiritual suffering where it's like you can't hear God, and you keep calling out, and you're wanting to hear from him, but you're not hearing from him. Some of you are dealing with doubt and depression. There's actually actual persecution even in our midst, right? I mean, for some of you that are employed especially, I think there's times when you get overlooked for positions because you're a believer and people know what you stand for, and you make them uncomfortable. Suffering essentially is just the experience of physical pain, spiritual pain, and or mental distress. It's not a too complicated of a definition. If when life doesn't go your way and you thought it would or it should, suffering's anything that hurts you or irritates you. So honestly, it can be anything, and usually it's something very different for each one of us. But here's something that suffering isn't. Suffering isn't virtuous in and of itself. It's not a sign of holiness. It's not something that gains us points with God. It's something you avoid, okay? Just FYI. If there's a path to choose suffering or not, go the not route, okay? That's not something we pursue at all. In chapter 1, Peter talks about all the various sufferings. And in the book of 1 Peter, he brings them up, like the government and the persecution that's happening under Nero. He talks about employee-employer relationships. He talks about other relationships and marriage. Well, there are different types of suffering that the Bible brings out. There's the suffering that happens because we live in a fallen world. There are natural disasters. There are evil governments. There's other sin against us. It's part of the fallenness. There's the consequences of our own sin. You know, when my mouth and tongue get out of control and I say things that I want to pull back, and it's out there already, and I'm experiencing the consequences of the choices of my words. There's suffering that comes with that. There's eternal suffering that the Bible talks about. And that's essentially for those who are saying, God, I don't want to have anything to do with you. And the Lord is saying, thy will be done. I will let that happen. I will not make you be near me. There's suffering through God's discipline. C.S. Lewis says, pain insists upon being attended to. God whispers to us in our pleasures, speaks in our consciousness, but shouts in our pains. It's his megaphone to rouse a deaf world. At times, the Lord will use pain and suffering to wake us up because we're headed on a path that's deviating from him and a path that's going to hurt us and others along the way. And lastly, there's the suffering that comes with persecution, right? It's when we voluntarily choose to align ourselves with Jesus and say, yeah, I'm a Christ follower, and the world does not want to have anything to do with that. In January of 2018, Newsweek had an article that said, the persecution and genocide of Christians across the world is worse today than at any time in history. That's not what I'm reading in the news. That's not on CNN or Fox. That's not what I'm seeing. So when I go into suffering, I have a default mode and I'm sure you all have a default mode at all. Mine is I isolate. And I get depressed, and I jump into victim thinking, and it's the whole why me? Why is this happening to me? I compare my lives with others that I deem are easier, and I'm like, well, why not them? Why me, right? Why? I start doubting God, and I can doubt his goodness. And then eventually there's all about numbing out, right? The other day I'd had a really hard day, and as I was driving home, I'm thinking, I cannot wait to get home and numb out on Netflix because I'm behind in Virgin River, and that's a really good series. Just check out. That's what I wanted to do. But I'll tell you this, if it had not been for trials and hardness in my life, you know what you would be hearing from a really self-righteous woman, a woman who has not experienced God's grace and faithfulness through the trial. Not plucking me out, but through it. I would have not grown in longing for heaven. I would not have had an eternal perspective that says, this isn't home. This is not my home. Home is heaven with the Lord. And you would be hearing a speaker that would be promoting a prosperity gospel, essentially, that says that, you know what? If you live a godly life, you can expect a good life. If you're not having a good life, what does that tell you? There's something wrong with your life. That's the conclusion. And I would be presenting a great formula for you of how many quiet times you need to have, what verses you need to memorize. It would not be a relationship with Jesus that walks us through hardness. So God wants suffering to be so much more than just tolerable in our lives. He really wants to use it in our lives in a good way. The world says, just endure it. It's tolerable. But he has so much more for us with it. And we're going to be looking at 1 Peter 4:12 through 19. And there it is. So let me read that for you all. Beloved, do not be surprised at the fiery trial when it comes upon you to test you as though something strange were happening to you. But rejoice insofar as you share Christ's sufferings, that you may also rejoice and be glad when his glory is revealed. You are insulted for the name of Christ. If you are insulted for the name of Christ, you are blessed, because the Spirit of glory and of God rests upon you. But let none of you suffer as a murderer or a thief or an evildoer or as a meddler. Yet if anyone suffers as a Christian, let him not be ashamed, but let him glorify God in that name. For it is time for judgment to begin at the household of God. And if it begins with us, what will be the outcome for those who do not obey the gospel of God? And if the righteous is scarcely saved, what will become of the ungodly and the sinner? Therefore, let those who suffer according to God's will entrust their souls to a faithful Creator while doing good. The first thing the Lord wants us to know is that, and Peter wants us to know, is that when hard times come, we should not be surprised. Oh, dang! There we go. Peter is saying hard times are the norm, okay? This is normal, and God is using them specifically to reveal to us where we need to be and where we need to grow specifically. You know what? I am not a person that likes surprises. I like planned surprises. Like if someone says, "Hey, I've got a surprise for you," or I say, when they say, "Where do we go to dinner?" I say, "Surprise me." But like a legit surprise where I am totally off guard, I don't like it at all. It just disorients me completely. And I'm sure you all have been on the side of doing something surprising for someone. And don't you feel like that initial expression on their faces? Oh my goodness. What am I doing here? Like, they probably don't know I need to be on the way to the airport getting my daughter. Like, but you're really thankful because they've been really intentional to want to serve you. That's how I feel about surprises. They mess up my life. They totally disorient me. Yeah, control freak. Go ahead and say it. I know that's what you're thinking, right? But Peter is saying that he's kind of doing a pre-talk with us, like we do with our kids. Like, here you're going to enter into this situation. And Peter says, don't let fiery trials surprise you, because you'll get disoriented and you'll lose your way, right? You totally get flustered. You don't know what the next step needs to be. But you know, not only Peter, but Jesus also told us not to be surprised. He told us straight up, you're going to have trouble. You're going to be persecuted, because I was persecuted. People are going to hate you. You know why? Because they hated me first. So he also is telling us, like, don't be surprised when hard things come. Scripture is full of pictures of what we can expect our life to look like. And so what it will look like as we walk with the Lord. He talks about an athlete or a soldier, how they're to endure hardship. That is what our walk with the Lord looks like. It talks about a child-parent relationship and how the parent lovingly, because they own you and care about you, discipline you and instruct you. And the Lord is saying, that's the same. I am the same. I love you, and so I will allow hardness into your life and training into your life, and you're not going to like it just as much as the kid doesn't like it with their parents. The Bible talks about vine dressers, those who prune vines, and I don't know, I'm just learning about all this stuff, but you know that for fruit trees, you prune them twice a year, and pretty heartily if you want good fruit. And that is what the Lord is saying. There are times I am going to be pruning things off of your life because I want good fruit for you. But lastly, what we see in this passage is the example of a fiery ordeal. And this goes to the idea of purifying gold. Gold was put in a refiner's fire. And what happened is the fire was so hot, it would melt off the dross, all the impurities, and it would leave the gold. And that was the goal. And that is the kind of trials that he allows in our lives. And we suffer through those impurities, those ways that truly are harmful to us and keep us from true dependence on the Lord. As those things get separated from the gold, we see that these are a bunch of things that are in my life that I need to work on. You know, when I think about the purpose of trials in my life, the purpose of it is to reveal the core of my heart and how my allegiances are not in the right place. I have an idea that it's Jesus plus whatever, right? It's Jesus plus whatever that's going to make my life right and good and on the right path and successful and easy. That's what I want, right? But you know what? Jesus is saying, I love you too much to let the plus be in there, because eventually your allegiance to those plus is going to destroy you. It's going to be bondage to you. You know, we suffer, but you know what? Even Jesus suffered. In Hebrews 5:8, it says, even though Jesus was God's son, he learned obedience from the things he suffered. And you're like, what? Learned obedience? He's sinless, right? What does that mean? And I like the way this commentary said, learned obedience, not meaning that he passed from sinfulness to sinlessness, but that he passed from untested obedience to fully tested obedience. Jesus proved himself over and over. So when you think about in the desert, when he was being tested, God was testing him, will you rely on me to take care of you and to meet your needs? Or are you going to take over and do it yourself? And he passed that test, and then he had another one. And he continued to suffer through choosing to make the right choice. So I know all these things. I read the Bible like you do. I know I'm not supposed to be surprised, but I still totally am surprised. Like, it just takes me off guard, right? How do you not be surprised? I don't know how to do that. Except that, well, I guess one of the reasons why I'm surprised is if you think about it, you know, we were created, Adam and Eve were created to live in the Garden of Eden, and that's where we're supposed to live to, right? That's what a perfected world looks like. Perfect relationship with God, constant communion, nothing coming in the way, perfect relationship with each other, perfect relationship with creation. That's the norm. But as we know, they fell and they blew it, and so they get kicked out of the garden. And you know what? God doesn't give them this cloak to help them deal with the brokenness of this world. So everything that happens now to them, they're like, wait a second, this isn't like the garden. And God's like, yeah, you're right. It's not. It's not the garden anymore. It's kind of like Dorothy, like this isn't Kansas anymore, right? Yeah. So I'm surprised because I'm created for perfection. I'm created for that. You know, and I've also bought some lies. I've bought the whole good girl lie. If I live a good girl life, right, I shouldn't suffer. And if I'm suffering, and if you're suffering, it's because you're doing something wrong. I've bought lies at times as I'm going through hard stuff that if God is loving and powerful, he would not allow this in my life. And so, therefore, he really must not love me. And then I get totally surprised by the length and the intensity of suffering. Like, sometimes it goes on and on and on. Some of them are short and they're a gift, but when they go on and on and on, it totally throws us for a loop. Our daughter Lauren, you've heard me share this. She had 4 brain surgeries in 5 years. The first time she was diagnosed with this brain tumor in her pituitary, we were all like, we can do this. We got this. And I felt like we suffered well. You should have been around us. Like, we were saying the right things, you know, we were hopeful. But then it came back. And it wasn't supposed to. And we had to have another surgery, and another surgery, and another surgery. And it got harder and harder and harder. And the dross, the impurity in my heart, as far as really entrusting my daughter to God, was totally coming out. I'm like, and I don't like what I'm seeing, God. I need you to take it away. So, you know, when I think about how we prepare ourselves not to be surprised, you know, when your kids were little and they'd hide behind a corner and you'd come up and they'd shock you, they'd surprise you, you know, and you'd be literally shocked. But then what would they do? They'd do it again, right? Right? Because they're like, they really love the reaction they got from you. And you're not as surprised that second time. But then they do it again, right? because they're like getting the reaction that they want. And I think that's what the Lord has for us. I think he's saying, you've been through trials before, you'll be in them again. Don't be surprised, because if you're surprised, you get disoriented and you don't come back to me. Well, let's go on. He also says, but rejoice insofar as you share Christ's sufferings, that you may also rejoice and be glad when his glory is revealed. So we need to rejoice, yeah. And honestly, this is a really hard picture and concept for me, because it feels so disingenuous to the reality of the hardness of life. Like, are you kidding? How do I rejoice? There's so many awful things in this world. How do I have that kind of expression when the hardness comes in my life? And I'll be honest, there are people in my life who do rejoice at times like that and will even thank God for the actual trial. And I'm like, oh, golly, I don't connect with you. I don't. Because I do think that we are not supposed to rejoice about the pain. We're supposed to rejoice about the promises God gives us as we walk through the pain. You know, Jesus felt pain and he didn't hide it, right? He was known as a man of sorrows, acquainted with grief. Scripture tells us to mourn with those who mourn and weep with those who weep. And it's not about being fake at all. We are totally given permission to grieve, and we see that Jesus grieved, right? He was about to raise Lazarus from the dead, and he weeps right before that, right? He's real. He's feeling the real deal. I think about Paul, and Paul grieved about what was going on in the churches and had a hard time with the fact that people were not choosing to follow the Lord. So the admonition to rejoice does not deny the reality of pain and grief. God understands it, and in fact, God endured it more than any other person in human history in the person of Christ on the cross. But here's what we're called to do. We're called to live in a tension, and it's the tension between suffering and rejoicing. It's both and. Jesus said, for the joy set before him, the rejoicing, he endured the cross, the suffering. We live in the reality of both of those. It says in Hebrews 11 that Moses stayed faithful to God because he was looking ahead to his reward. So we grieve, but we don't grieve like the world grieves, because we have hope that the world does not have at all. Everyone suffers, right? Everyone. No one's exempt from that. But not everyone has hope. In 1 Corinthians 4, Paul talks about this tension, and he says, we're afflicted in every way, but not crushed, perplexed, but not driven to despair, persecuted, but not forsaken, struck down, but not destroyed. It's no sugarcoating that this is not Eden, that this is not the perfect world, but we're not destroyed because of God in our lives. So holding the tension, it's between the now and the not yet. The now of this fallen world and the not yet, that this will be done one day. And we will not be enduring the pain. In 2 Corinthians 4:17, it says, for this light momentary affliction is preparing for us an eternal weight of glory beyond all comparison, as we look not to the things that are seen, but to the things that are unseen. That's what we're supposed to be looking at. For the things that are seen are transient, but the things that are unseen are eternal. I need some new glasses, for sure. So why do we rejoice? If we're not supposed to rejoice about the pain, right? That's not being genuine. That's not who God is, who Jesus modeled, how he's to suffer. What do we rejoice in? We rejoice that this is purposeful pain, that there's a reason for this. Tim Keller talks about that this pain is about rooting out What I didn't know was in there, was in me, my false allegiances, the things that I am committed to that I believe are going to give me life, that are going to make my life really good, right? Like a good job and security financially. All these things that we suffer, whatever they are for you, they might be different, but I know I have certain things in my life that I'm like, my life falls apart when this is not true in my life. And we all have those things, and that's what's being rooted out in this fiery trial. Ultimately, this is a purposeful trial, a purposeful suffering, because if God were to leave that in our lives, it would harm us, and it would get us off of our allegiance to him. Our suffering also reminds us, if we do it well, that we belong to Jesus, that we live with a hope that the world cannot offer to us at all. And as a result, we can be the vehicles of mercy and grace to other people as God met us in that really hard place. You know what? One of the other things that I like about suffering, which sounds awful, is that God is my loving Father that does not give in to my whining. That is a good thing. Because there are times where I'm like, Lord, take this away. Like, I'm here again. Like, how did this happen? I've thought I was making different choices. And once again, I'm here. Take this away. And I'm so glad he doesn't just go, okay, you get an easy pass. He loves me too much to let me keep going on in the same way. And he shows me what needs to go away. And you know, honestly, we can't grow in trust without trouble, right? Why should you trust? Why should you depend if life is easy for us? And if you think about it, think about the people in your life who have modeled suffering well to you. Are they not the ones that you look to when you're in a hard place? I think that both to other believers and the non-Christian world, that when we as Christians can hold the tension between, yeah, this is really hard, and yet God, it's a new paradigm for them. And we're drawn to those people because I'm like, I want more of that. Where did you get that from? Who do you know that helped you become like that? So, obedience means that we rejoice, not in the pain, but honestly in what it will produce for us. Okay. Thirdly, if you're insulted for the name of Christ, you're blessed because the Spirit of glory and of God rests upon you. But let none of you suffer as a murderer or a thief or an evildoer or a meddler. Yet if anyone suffers as a Christian, let him not be ashamed. Let him glorify God in that name. So the way we endure suffering well is we need to examine ourselves. You know what? Sometimes we're suffering because it's all about what we did, right? And we cannot say, well, I'm suffering because I'm a Christian, right? I mean, we need to really look back and think, what was my contribution in this? You know, it's having that humble, honest assessment of, I could have said that more nicely, right? I could have been more sacrificial. I could have stepped into that in a different tone, in a different manner. But if you're being insulted because of Jesus, and because you've aligned yourself with him, then it says that you're blessed, that God's Spirit is resting on you, and that you should not be ashamed. And essentially, you're called a Christian, and Christian means a little Christ one. You're a chip off the old block, essentially. That's what that means. And so if you're being insulted because of your alignment with Jesus and your identification with him, amen to that. Like, awesome. Well, you should be celebrating that you would be so lucky to be persecuted in that way. It's pretty harsh words as far as like, don't suffer as a murderer, right? A thief, evildoer, meddler. And commentaries say that those were essentially how people would retaliate when they were persecuted during that time, right? And it makes sense. It was a brutal world, and murder, I think, was a lot more common than it is today, especially under Rome. But it says, don't retaliate. Do not go and, do not suffer by retaliating in a way that would bring dishonor to you. And the aspect of meddling, it's like taking control over something and instead of letting things play out. So how do we deal with that? I think one of the most powerful witnesses we can have in this world when we have seen ourselves meddle, essentially, because I don't think many of you are killing or thieving or evil doing, and you're pulling out your witchcraft voodoo dolls. I do think one of the best things that is a witness to this world is when we come back and say, you know what, I was really wrong in how I handled that situation. And I really don't think that honored the Lord. I think that blows Christians' minds, or non-Christian minds. They don't know what to do with that. They don't know, first of all, they don't experience people asking for forgiveness for the things that they've done. And they have a label for Christians that Christians would never do something like that. Well, lastly, it says for it is time for judgment to begin at the household of God. And if it begins with us, what will be the outcome for those who do not obey the gospel of God? And if the righteous is scarcely saved, what will become of the ungodly and the sinner? So essentially what this is saying, that now as believers is our time for fiery trials. And that time is a time of purifying. It's not a judgment time, because we know that we're not going to be judged for our sins because they've been covered and taken care of by Jesus. But it says, whoa, those of you who have not had your sins covered by Jesus, the fiery trial will be really a lot more painful because it will be a judgment time. So Peter's saying this is another reason to be thankful, that your trials are not at all about whether you are getting into heaven or not. They are all about God purifying you and making you more and more like him. Lastly, it says, therefore, let those who suffer according to God's will entrust their souls to a faithful Creator while doing good. Entrust yourself to God and do good. So it's interesting. I was looking up, there's a difference between the word trust and entrust. So trust means to place your confidence in and rely on, okay? But entrust means trust to the care of. There's an emotional component with that. It's also a banking term that's used like where people say, okay, I'm giving you all my money. I'm pushing it all across the table, and I need you. I'm entrusting all of this to you because I believe you have my best interest at heart. I love it that it says in there that we need to entrust ourselves to a faithful Creator. He's faithful because he is loving. He never stops loving us. And as a creator, he is totally all powerful. And then it goes on to say that we continue to do good. You do the next thing. Sometimes in times of suffering, I'm like, what am I supposed to do? And I think the Lord's just saying to me, just do the next right thing. Do the next thing. My grandmother from Poland lived with us growing up with me until I went off to college. And her name was Baba. And whenever we would get any money, Baba would say, bring it to the Bank of Baba, because Baba will take care of it, you know? And she said it with her good Polish accent. Deanne does a good Polish accent. And you know what? Whenever I got that money back, there was more. It was entrusted into good hands that gave me back even more. Entrusting ourselves to God always produces greater reward. You know, I think our posture and times of suffering needs to be, not my will, but your will be done. It's that open-handed posture of, God, I'm letting go. I don't get this. I don't like it, but I trust you and I love you and I trust that you are going to take care of my heart. The opposite, honestly, you don't have to go this route. But what's the opposite? The opposite is that we get bitter, right? We're a lot of self-pity, victim thinking. You stop praying. You just stop talking to God because you feel like you're not even being heard, and you give up. I think we turn our back on God. I know for me, the opposite is the constant asking, why? Why is this happening to me? And it reminds me of back when I was in college and I had 3 years of chemistry. Don't ask me why, because I don't remember anything, and it was it was a mistake. Anyway. But I kept thinking, like, I am never going to use this chemistry. I never have used biochem or organic, or I have never used it. And I was like, why am I in these classes? And I never got an answer for it. But what I did learn is that while I never used it, what I did learn was that what I did use was the hard work that came with studying those classes. And that was applicable and is still applicable all over the place. So in closing, I'm going to go back to 1 Peter 3:18 through 22. It says, "For Christ also suffered once for sins, the righteous for the unrighteous, that he might bring us to God, being put to death in the flesh, but made alive in the Spirit, in which he went and proclaimed to the spirits in prison, because they formerly did not obey, when God's patience waited in the days of Noah, while the ark was being prepared, in which a few, that is 8 persons, were brought safely through water. Baptism, which corresponds to this, now saves you, not as a removal of dirt from the body, but as an appeal to God for a good conscience through the resurrection of Jesus Christ, who has gone into heaven and is at the right hand of God, with angels, authorities, and powers having been subjected to him." So as I read about all of this, I read that this is the most misunderstood, not understood passage in the New Testament. Like, commentators since Martin Luther are like, we don't know what this is about. And I read that someone compared it to, like, if you at Christmas time, you get a big gift for your child that has many parts to it that have to be assembled. You put it together, it's working great, and then you look in the box and you see like there's 7 extra pieces and you have no idea what to do with them. That's what they were saying about this passage, essentially. There's so many aspects to it that we don't know what Peter was trying to say. But here's what we do know what Peter was trying to say. That while both Jesus and Noah went through really hard times, they were brought through safely in the end. They were vindicated in the end, and that is what God will do for you as well. I love the first part where it's, nope. There, yes. "For Christ also suffered once for sins, the righteous for the unrighteous, that he might bring us back to God." You know, when we think about suffering, we think, how do we do it? We look at Jesus and how he did it. He suffered for the unrighteous. And the unrighteous aren't those out there. They're here. They're us. They're me. He did not suffer for nothing. It wasn't unfair. It was unfair, actually, for him because he was totally righteous. But we weren't. And he said, I'm going to step into this suffering because otherwise you won't be close to God. And I'm going to take that on so that you guys can be close to God. He can help us because he went through it before us, and we are not alone. Let me close our time in prayer, and then I've got a song I want us to listen to. Jesus, Father, thank you that this message is a challenge for me, and I speak from a place of learning, and hoping that you will help me remember this the next time I am surprised by a trial and what you want me to push into. And Father, I know there are so many difficulties, so many hard things that women are going through in this room. And I know that I've spoken more from my head. And I just know that you can touch their hearts for sure. And we believe, Lord, that you are walking through it with them and they are not alone. And you're good in it all. And I pray that you would give us all eyes to see and to declare not only the promises in your word, but the goodness that we see in our lives every day, day in, day out. Thank you, Lord Jesus. The treat we have for you is next week. A friend of the one is going to come and share, and she's going through a cancer trial. So she's in it. She's in the depth of it, and she's going through it beautifully. Hope you guys enjoy this song.